The funeral was quiet, almost suffocatingly so, as though the grief itself had stolen everyone's voices. I sat in the front row, clutching the folded handkerchief in my lap, my eyes fixed on the polished wood of the coffin. My husband-me partner of 10 years was gone, and all that remained were memories and a mountain of unanswered questions. I thought the hardest part of losing him would be this day, this farewell. I had no idea the real devastation was still waiting, hidden like a cruel trick behind locked doors and sealed envelopes. When the service ended, people came to me with their condolences. Words blurred together, "Sorry for your loss. He was a good man. Stay strong." I nodded, smiled politely, and thanked them, but my heart was too numb to respond. What struck me most, though, was the way my mother-in-law hovered nearby. She wore black, of course, but there was something about her eyes sharp, cold, calculating that unsettled me. Even in mourning, she carried herself like a queen at court, accepting pity with one hand while clutching control with the other. She had never been warm to me, never truly welcoming. And that day, when she embraced me, her whisper was not comfort but command. "Come to the lawyer's office tomorrow. We need to finalize the will." Her tone made it sound less like a formality and more like a verdict waiting to be read. The next morning, I walked into the dimly lit office of Mr. Gallagher, the family lawyer. The walls were lined with books, their spines cracked with age, and the faint smell of ink and leather filled the room. My palms were sweating. I had reason to believe my husband had left everything to Mew had talked about it before. The house, the savings, the business. It was not greed that reassured me, but fairness. After all, I had paid for half of everything. I had stood by him when he struggled, supported him when he doubted himself. Surely, his last act would honor that partnership. Mr. Gallagher cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and unfolded a document with slow precision. "This," he said, "is the last will and testament of James Harrington." I straightened in my chair. My mother-in-law, seated across from me, crossed her arms, a faint smirk flickering at the corner of her lips. "As stated," the lawyer began, "James Harrington leaves his entire estate, including properties, bank accounts, and investments to his mother, Margaret Harrington." The words struck me like a slap across the face. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My ears rang, drowning out the rest of the lawyer's monotone recitation. Everything? To her? I leaned forward, my voice trembling. That can't be right. He promised Wade discuss this. We built our lives together. Why would he? My words faltered, tears blurring my vision. My mother-in-law's smirk widened into something colder. "He came to his senses, dear. Blood is blood. You were just a chapter in his life. I'm his mother. Family comes first." The cruelty of it was unbearable. Not only was she reveling in my devastation, but she was also erasing me from the very life I had helped build. I turned desperately to the lawyer. "Is there no mistake? Did he not leave anything at all for me?" Mr. Gallagher sighed, regret lining his face, but his voice remained firm. This is the latest version of his will. It was signed, witnessed, and notarized. I'm afraid it's legally binding. The room spun around me. The house I had poured my savings into, the life I had sacrificed for, every dream we had, shared it, was all slipping through my fingers, handed to the woman who had never hidden her disdain for me. I stumbled out of the office, the sound of my mother-in-law's heels clicking behind me like a victory march. Outside, the crisp air hit me, but it did nothing to steady the storm inside. Questions screamed in my mind. Why would James do this to me? Had I misjudged our entire marriage? Was his love for me just an illusion, a mask that hid the truth of his loyalty to her? That night, I wandered the house like a ghost, my fingers brushing over furniture we had picked out together, photographs of vacations, gifts exchanged on anniversaries. Each object felt tainted now, mocking me with the memory of a man who might never have truly been mine. I replayed every argument, every moment he had chosen his mother's side over mine. Had those been warnings I refused to see? The silence was broken only by my sobs, raw and relentless. Yet beneath the grief, something else stirred a seed of suspicion. People don't just rewrite their wills without reason. Someone must have pushed him, manipulated him, cornered him into this decision. And who else but her? My mother-in-law, with her icy grip and unrelenting control. But what if it went deeper than that? What if James himself had betrayed me, willingly, deliberately? The thought cut deeper than any knife. As I lay awake in the darkness, one thing became clear. I could not accept this. Not without answers. Not without uncovering the truth of what really happened before his death. And as I would soon discover, the truth was far more twisted, far more heartbreaking than I could have ever imagined. The next morning, I awoke with swollen eyes and a hollow ache in my chest. Grief still weighed heavily on me, but beneath it pulsed a sharp thread of anger. I couldn't stop replaying the lawyer's words, the cruel triumph in my mother-in-law's voice. Everything left to her very thing I had built my life upon, gone. But anger has a way of keeping sorrow from drowning you completely. It lit a fire in me, urging me to search, to question, to uncover what really happened. I started with James's office upstairs. He'd always been meticulous, his desk organized with military precision. I opened drawers, rifled through files, searching for any clue that could explain why he would betray me so thoroughly. Bank statements, tax records, investment portfolios all stacked neatly, but none of it made sense. His life, our life, had been entwined, so why would he unravel it with the stroke of a pen? As I dug deeper, I found something odd, a receipt tucked between folders. It was dated only a month before his death payment to the very lawyer we had seen. The amount was substantial, more than a simple consultation fee. My stomach tightened. Had he rewritten the will then? And if so, why had he never mentioned it to me? The sound of the front door startled me. My heart leapt into my throat. When I peeked down the staircase, I saw her. Margaret. My mother-in-law. She had a spare key. Of course, James had insisted years ago. She walked into my house as if it were already hers, her eyes roaming over the living room like she was taking inventory. "What are you doing here?" I demanded, rushing downstairs, clutching the receipt in my hand. She glanced at me, her lips curling into that infuriating half-smile. "Collecting what's mine. James's things will be moved soon. Don't make this harder than it has to be." I trembled with rage. "Yours? This was my home. I paid for this house before I even met your son. You can't just take it all." "Oh, but I can." Her voice was calm, almost soothing, like a teacher correcting a child. James knew where his loyalties lay. He wanted me protected, not you. You'll leave eventually. Better get used to it. The audacity of her words hit me like another blow. My hands shook, but I steadied my voice. "You manipulated him, didn't you? You always whispered in his ear, always tried to turn him against me. You hated me from the start." For the first time, her mask slipped, her eyes hardened. "You never belonged here. James was mine before he was yours, and now he's mine again even in death." Her words cut deeper than knives. It wasn't just about money. It was about possession, about control. She hadn't lost a son. She had reclaimed ownership of everything he left behind. That night, I couldn't sleep. Her voice echoed in my head, each word laced with venom. But as I stared at the ceiling, the receipt still clutched in my hand. Something inside me shifted. If she thought she could erase me, she was wrong. The next day, I returned to the lawyer's office. Mr. Gallagher looked startled to see me again so soon. "Please," I said, setting the receipt on his desk, "explain this. He came to you just a month before he died. Was that when he changed the will?" The lawyer hesitated, adjusting his glasses nervously. "Yes. James did return to update his will. He was insistent." "Insistent or pressured?" I pressed. His silence spoke louder than words. He cleared his throat. "I am bound by confidentiality." But off the record he seemed uneasy, nervous, like a man being pushed into a corner. My heart hammered. By her? By his mother? The lawyer didn't answer directly, but the flicker in his eyes was enough. I left the office with a storm raging in me. The betrayal stung sharper now. James hadn't just chosen her, he'd been cornered, manipulated. But why hadn't he trusted me enough to tell me? Why had he gone to his grave with that secret? As I drove home, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from an unknown number. The text was short, chilling, and it made my blood run cold. "You don't know the whole story. Meet me tomorrow at the cafe on 5th Street, 10 a.m. Don't tell her." I stared at the screen, my pulse racing. Who could it be? A friend of James's? Someone from his work? Or someone who knew the truth about Margaret's influence? I barely slept that night, torn between dread and curiosity. When morning came, I forced myself out of bed, dressed, and drove to the cafe. My hands shook as I pushed open the door and scanned the room. In the corner, a man I barely recognized lifted his hand. He was older, his face lined, his suit worn but neat. I approached cautiously. "You're James's lawyer before Gallagher, aren't you?" I asked, recognition dawning. He nodded gravely. "Yes. And I need to tell you something. James made another will, one you haven't seen. The world tilted beneath me. Another will? Could it be true?" My breath caught in my throat as he slid a manila envelope across the table. "He left this with me for safekeeping. He was afraid. He said if anything happened, you needed to have this." With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope. Inside was a neatly typed document signed, dated, witnessed. My eyes raced across the words, and there it was, everything left to me: the house, the savings, the business. My chest tightened with a mix of relief and rage. Relief that I hadn't been entirely betrayed. Rage that someone close had buried this truth, replacing it with a will that destroyed me. And I knew exactly who: Margaret Harrington. I clutched the second will in my hands, my fingers trembling, the weight of its truth pressing down on me. The cafe buzzed with quiet chatter around us, but for me, the world had gone silent, narrowed down to the words on that paper. Everything left to me, not her, not Margaret. My voice was barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you come forward sooner? Why did you let her win? The older lawyer, Mr. Dawson?" I now remembered his name sighed heavily, his eyes full of regret. "James made me promise to keep this sealed unless something happened that made me believe foul play was involved. He was afraid of his mother, afraid of what she might do if she found out." I thought Gallagher's version was final, but when I saw her gloating at the funeral, I knew something wasn't right. My stomach twisted, afraid of his own mother. How deep did her control go? What kind of hold had she had over him, even at the end of his life? I left the cafe with the envelope pressed tightly to my chest, my mind spinning, relief mingled with fury. James hadn't completely betrayed me, but he had been too weak to protect me from her, and now it was up to me to fight. When I arrived home, Margaret's car was already in the driveway. My heart sank. She was waiting for me. Inside, I found her in the kitchen, sipping tea like she belonged there. "You're late," she said coolly, as if she were the mistress of the house and I the unwelcome guest. I set my bag on the counter and stared at her, the will burning a hole in my purse. "Why did you do it?" My voice shook with barely restrained anger. "Why did you force James to rewrite his will?" She arched an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "Force? Darling, you give me too much credit. James loved me. He wanted to make sure I was cared for. Unlike you, he knew who his real family was." The words stabbed, but I refused to flinch. "I found the other will, Margaret. The one he left with Dawson. He wanted me to have everything. Not you." For the first time, the color drained from her face. The teacup rattled as she set it down, her fingers tightening around the porcelain. You're lying." I pulled the envelope from my purse and slid it across the table. Her eyes scanned the pages, her lips trembling as she read. Then, in a sudden burst of rage, she shoved the papers away, nearly knocking her cup to the floor. "No, this isn't real. It can't be. He changed it. He chose me." Her voice cracked, the calm facade crumbling into raw hysteria. I leaned closer, my voice low and steady. "He was scared of you. That's why he made another will in secret. He knew what you were capable of." Her eyes blazed, and for a moment I saw something feral flicker behind them. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the tile. "You think you've won, don't you? But this isn't over. That piece of paper won't protect you from me." Before I could respond, she stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls rattled. I sank into the chair, my whole body shaking. My chest heaved with shallow breaths as I stared at the will on the table. She wasn't just angry, Shay was unhinged. And I had no idea how far she would go to keep control. That night, sleep was impossible. Every sound in the house made me jolt awake, the creak of the floorboards, the groan of the wind. I kept seeing her eyes, wild and full of hate, the way she spat her threats like venom. By morning, I decided I couldn't do this alone. I needed backup. I called Mr. Dawson, asking him what my next step should be. He advised me to file the second will with the court immediately, but his voice carried a warning. "She won't go down quietly," he said. "Be prepared for a fight." He didn't have to tell me twice. The next few days blurred into a whirlwind of legal documents, court filings, and endless tension. Margaret's fury escalated with every passing hour. She left voicemails, her voice shrill with rage. She showed up outside the house, screaming that I was a thief, a liar, a whore who had bewitched her son. Neighbors began to whisper, their eyes darting between us as though they were watching a live performance of some twisted play. I tried to ignore her, but inside, fear gnawed at me. What if she did something reckless? What if she tried to destroy the will? Or worse, what if she tried to destroy me? On the third night, I woke to the smell of smoke. Panic jolted me upright. I ran downstairs and found a small fire smoldering in the trash bin by the back door, a charred matchbook lying nearby. My knees buckled. It hadn't started by accident. Someone had been here. My heart pounded as I grabbed the fire extinguisher, smothering the flames. By the time it was out, my hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold the nozzle. The will was safe. I had hidden it in a lockbox upstairs, but the message was clear. Margaret wasn't just threatening anymore. She was acting. The next morning, I marched to the police station, lockbox in hand. I filed a report, showing them the evidence, telling them everything. The officer took my statement, his expression grave. "We'll keep an eye on her. But until the court decides, this is going to get messy." Messy. That was an understatement. The court date came faster than I expected. The room buzzed with murmurs as people shuffled into their seats. I sat at the plaintiff's table, the second will secured in front of me. Margaret sat across the aisle, her face pale but defiant. her eyes darting toward me with a hatred so sharp I could feel it pierce my skin. When the judge called us to order, Margaret rose, her voice loud and trembling. "She's lying! That will is a forgery. James loved me. He would never leave me with nothing." But as Dawson took the stand, his testimony painted a different picture. He described James's fear, his determination, the secrecy with which he had prepared the second will. Each word chipped away at her defenses, each fact pulling her closer to collapse. I watched her closely, and for the first time, I saw something breaking inside her. The proud, untouchable woman who had walked into the lawyer's office weeks ago was unraveling before my eyes. But I also knew it wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. The courtroom felt like a theater stage, every gaze fixed on Margaret as she clutched the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Her breaths came in jagged bursts, her face reddening as Dawson calmly continued his testimony. Each fact he presented was another stone added to the weight already crushing her. "No!" she suddenly shrieked, her voice echoing off the marble walls. "This is all lies. He would never betray me." The judge pounded the gavel, calling for order, but Margaret's meltdown only intensified. She lurched forward, pointing a trembling finger at me. "She poisoned him. She turned my son against me. That's why he wrote that second will. She bewitched him like the snake she is." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to remain still, composed, while her mask crumbled. I knew the judge wasn't blind to her hysteria. This display was doing more damage to her than anything I could have said. Dawson remained steady, his voice firm. "Your Honor, the document in question is authentic. Signed and notarized. I was there. James wanted his wife provided for. He did not trust his mother with his estate." Margaret shook her head violently, strands of hair coming loose from her bun. "No! He promised me. He said this house, this money, it would all be mine. She doesn't deserve it. She was nothing but a leech." Her words were venom, spat with such fury that the bailiff had to step forward, gently placing a hand on her arm to steady her. But she jerked away, her voice cracking into sobs. The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Mrs. Whitmore, unless you can present evidence to support your claims, I suggest you compose yourself. Hysteria will not help your case." The room hushed, heavy with tension. I sat frozen, my hands folded in my lap, though my heart hammered so loudly I thought everyone could hear it. Margaret's eyes flickered around the room, searching desperately for anyone to back her up, but the silence was deafening. Even her allies shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to be dragged into her collapse. And then, suddenly, she sank back into her chair, her shoulders heaving as tears spilled down her face. Her voice softened into a broken whisper. "I just wanted him back. He was all I had left." For the first time, I almost saw her not as a villain but as a grieving mother, terrified of being forgotten, almost. But then I remembered the fire in my kitchen, the threats, the lies, and my sympathy hardened into stone. The judge called for a recess, his voice stern but measured. "We will reconvene in 1 hour. Both parties, collect yourselves." I rose quickly, gathering my things, my lawyer guiding me toward the hallway. The moment we stepped outside, my legs buckled, the adrenaline draining from me. I leaned against the cool wall, gasping for air. "You're doing fine," Dawson reassured, placing a steadying hand on my shoulder. "Stay calm. She's unraveling, and everyone sees it." But as I nodded, trying to steady my breath, I caught sight of Margaret at the far end of the hallway. She was slumped on a bench, her face buried in her hands. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, but when she looked up, her eyes met mine, and what I saw wasn't weakness. It was fury, a promise that this wasn't finished. When the session resumed, the tension was thicker than before. Margaret's lawyer attempted to regain control, presenting flimsy arguments that the second will was fraudulent, that Dawson was lying, that James had been manipulated, but their case crumbled quickly under scrutiny. Every witness they brought forward was either biased or uncertain, while Dawson's records and sworn testimony stood unshaken. Finally, it was my turn to speak. My legs trembled as I walked to the stand, but once I sat down, something inside me solidified. I had lived through the lies, the grief, the humiliation. Now it was my chance to speak the truth. "My husband and I built a life together," I said, my voice clear though my hands trembled. "I worked 2 jobs to help pay for our home. I stood by him through every trial. But in the end, his mother tried to erase me, as though I had never been a part of his life. She wanted everything not because she needed it, but because she couldn't stand to lose control." I paused, glancing at Margaret. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, her face pale with rage. "The second will is proof of what James truly wanted," I continued, my throat tightening. "And if you look past the hysteria, past the accusations, you'll see what this really is. A mother who couldn't let go, even if it meant destroying the person her son loved most." The courtroom was silent. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. The judge scribbled notes, his expression unreadable, then dismissed me from the stand. When I returned to my seat, Dawson leaned close and whispered, "That was perfect." But as the gavel struck to close the day's proceedings, I couldn't shake the feeling that the battle wasn't just in the courtroom. Margaret's rage was too raw, too consuming. She wouldn't accept defeat, and I knew before this was over she would try something desperate. That night, I double-locked every door and window. I moved the will back into the lockbox and hid it in a place only I knew. But even with every precaution, unease gnawed at me. Sleep didn't come. Each shadow felt alive, each sound a threat. And then at 3 a.m, the phone rang. I jolted upright, my heart pounding as I reached for the receiver. A voice, low and trembling with fury, hissed through the line. "You may have fooled the court today, but this isn't over. I'll make sure you lose everything even if it kills me." The line went dead. My hand shook as I set the phone down, bile rising in my throat. Margaret wasn't giving up. She was preparing for war, and I was running out of time. The days following Margaret's late-night call were drenched in paranoia. Every time the floor creaked or the wind rattled against the window, I startled. I barely slept, afraid that if I closed my eyes, I'd wake to smoke, broken glass, or worse. Her words echoed endlessly in my head, even if it kills me. My lawyer urged me not to engage, to document everything and report the threats to the police. I did, filing a statement, but deep down I knew Margaret was too cunning to leave proof that could be used against her. She wouldn't show her hand until the moment she believed she could win. One afternoon, as I returned from the market, I noticed my mailbox hung open. The envelopes inside had been ripped apart, tossed carelessly. My stomach twisted as I sorted through them. A court notice, important bills gone. Whoever had done it wanted to disrupt my life, to leave me scrambling. I lifted my gaze and froze. Across the street, Margaret stood by her car, staring at me. Her lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. She didn't speak, didn't wave. She simply got into the car and drove away. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the lockbox where the will was hidden. The document was the only thing standing between me and ruin. If she managed to destroy it or convince someone it wasn't real, I'd lose everything. The next court date loomed closer, and with it, the weight of every sleepless night pressed harder on my shoulders. Dawson reassured me that the evidence was airtight, but Margaret's persistence gnawed at my resolve. And then, just when I thought she couldn't sink any lower, she struck again. It was during the family remembrance service for James. His cousins and old friends gathered at the church to honor his memory. I had debated attending, worried about Margaret's presence, but Dawson insisted it was important to show my face, to remind everyone that I was still James's wife, still family despite her attempts to erase me. I arrived early, dressed in black, clutching the small bouquet I had chosen for his grave. The whispers began as soon as I entered. Heads turned, conversations hushed. People looked between me and Margaret, who sat at the front pew with her head held high, as though she were the grieving widow, not me. When the service began, Margaret's composure cracked. She stood up mid-sermon, her voice breaking as she declared, "My son would never have wanted his wife to inherit everything. He told me himself he regretted ever marrying her." Gasps filled the sanctuary. I felt every eye burn into me, some filled with pity, others with suspicion. The priest tried to calm her, but she refused to sit down. "She bewitched him," Margaret cried. "She manipulated him until he didn't know what he was signing. And now she hides behind that so-called will, trying to take everything from me." I wanted to vanish into the pew. My cheeks burned. My pulse thundered in my ears. But then, unexpectedly, Dawson stood. He wasn't just my lawyer, he had been James's friend, and his voice cut through the chaos with steady conviction. "James confided in me," Dawson said. "He loved his wife. He feared his mother's control. That's why he wrote the second will. Out of love, not regret." The church fell silent. Margaret's face contorted with rage, her cries turning into incoherent screams until her own relatives had to usher her out. The humiliation hung heavy in the air, but for the first time, I felt the tide shift. People saw her not as the dignified mother she pretended to be, but as a desperate woman unraveling before their eyes. Still, I knew better than to celebrate. Margaret was like a storm cloud, destructive and impossible to ignore, and storms always came back. The following week, the court case resumed. Margaret arrived in dark glasses, her face pale, her hair unkempt. The sharpness in her posture was gone, replaced by something jagged, almost wild. Her lawyer looked exasperated, carrying a stack of papers he shuffled nervously. When the proceedings began, Margaret did something no one expected. She requested to testify on her own behalf. The judge hesitated, clearly wary after her last outburst, but eventually allowed it. She stood at the witness stand, her voice trembling, her eyes darting between me and the judge. I raised James alone after his father died. I gave him everything. I was his world, and he was mine. And then she came along. She pointed at me with venom and stole him from me. She twisted his mind. She turned him against his own mother. Her words clawed at me, but I remained silent, knowing that reacting would only give her power. I deserve that estate, she continued, tears sliding down her face. Not her. I carried him. I raised him. I loved him more than anyone ever could. Without me, he wouldn't have had a life to give. Her voice cracked, and for a fleeting second, some in the courtroom softened. But then Dawson rose, his tone firm but calm. With all due respect, love doesn't give someone the right to erase a spouse. James's wishes are clear. This case isn't about who loved him more. It's about honoring the law. The judge leaned back, rubbing his temples. The air was heavy, thick with the weight of decades of love, grief, and betrayal colliding in that one room. When the session adjourned, I walked out with trembling hands. Margaret was waiting at the exit, her face blotchy with tears, but her eyes burning with fury. As I passed, she leaned in close, her whisper like a knife. You may win this case, but you'll never win peace. I'll haunt you until the day you die. Her words chilled me to the bone. That night, I dreamed of James's face blurred, his voice distant. He stood between me and Margaret, reaching out, but when I tried to grab his hand, he faded into smoke. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, realizing that no matter what the court decided, the scars of this battle would never fully heal. The final verdict was near, and Margaret, cornered and desperate, was more dangerous than ever. The final hearing arrived with the kind of tension that gnaws at your bones. I barely slept the night before, pacing the length of my bedroom until dawn bled into the sky. My body ached with exhaustion, but my nerves kept me upright. Today, everything would either end or explode beyond repair. The courthouse steps were crowded with familiar faces, neighbors, distant relatives, even a couple of James's old co-workers. Word of the family feud had spread like wildfire, and people came to watch the collapse firsthand. I kept my chin high, forcing myself not to shrink under their stares. Inside, the courtroom buzzed. Margaret sat on the opposite bench, her black dress wrinkled, her hair pulled back too tightly, her eyes hollow yet still sharp with venom. Her lawyer whispered frantically in her ear, but she shook him off with a wave of her hand. She wasn't listening to anyone anymore. The judge entered, and the room fell into silence. Papers shuffled, pens clicked, and I felt my pulse echo in my ears. This was it. Dawson began with the second will. He laid out its authenticity-verified handwriting, notarization, clear dates. The evidence was undeniable. Then came my testimony. My voice wavered at first, but soon steadied as I told the court about the nights James and I spent together drafting our future, his whispered fears of being consumed by his mother's control, and his insistence that he wanted me to be secure if he were gone. When I finished, the judge nodded, his expression grave but sympathetic. Then Margaret rose. Her voice was hoarse, but still laced with defiance. "That second will is a forgery," she said, her words cracking through the courtroom like thunder. My son was confused, pressured, manipulated by her. He told me everything, and I know he wanted me to have his estate. His real wishes are in the first will, the one that gave it all to me. She slammed her hand on the railing, and her lawyer tugged at her sleeve, pleading silently for restraint. But she ignored him, her eyes blazing. "You all think I'm crazy," she spat, glaring at the crowd. "But you didn't raise him. I did, alone. Every meal, every scraped knee, every sacrifice me, not her. What did she ever give him? A roof? A bed? She didn't bleed for him, didn't suffer for him. I did. This estate is mine because he was mine." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. I could feel the shift, the collective realization that this wasn't about inheritance anymore. This was obsession. Dawson calmly stood. "With respect, Mrs. Harding, the law is not based on possession. James was a man, not a piece of property. He had the right to choose, and he chose to protect his wife." The judge's gavel cracked against the wood, silencing the murmurs. He leaned forward, his face lined with exhaustion. "I've heard enough. The evidence is clear. The second will is legitimate. The estate will go to his legal spouse. Case closed." For a breathless moment, the world seemed to still. Relief surged through me like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. But then, just as quickly, the storm struck back. Margaret screamed, a raw, guttural sound that made the hairs on my neck rise. She lunged at me across the aisle, knocking over chairs as guards scrambled to intercept her. Her fingers clawed at the air, just inches from my face. "You stole him from me!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "You stole everything! He was mine! He was supposed to be with me forever!" Her words, shrill and unhinged, echoed through the chamber as guards dragged her back. Her feet kicked, her body thrashed, but her face twisted. Broken was what seared itself into my memory. The judge called for order, but the courtroom had already descended into chaos. Family members wept. Reporters scribbled furiously. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my chest, watching as the woman who had tormented me unraveled completely in front of everyone. Outside, reporters swarmed the steps, their microphones and cameras thrust toward me. How do you feel about winning? Do you fear retaliation? Was James aware of the damage this would cause? I said nothing, only pushing my way through the crowd, Dawson shielding me with his arm. My relief was tangled with dread. The estate was mine now, yes, but at what cost? Margaret's words haunted me. She would not stop. Not now, not ever. That night I sat alone in the living room. The house felt both like a fortress and a prison. Boxes of documents and personal items cluttered the table, proof of everything I had endured. Yet the silence pressed heavy against my ears. Suddenly, I heard a sound of faint scratching, like fingernails against glass. My heart thudded as I crept toward the front door. When I opened it, the night air rushed in. The porch was empty, but at my feet lay a single photograph. It was James, smiling, holding me close. Across the picture, in thick black ink, were the words, "This should have been mine." My knees nearly gave way. My hands trembled as I clutched the photo, scanning the street, the shadows, the hedges. Nothing, only silence. I locked every door, every window, and sank to the floor, clutching the photograph to my chest. Margaret was gone from the courthouse, but not from my life. She was still out there, still watching, still waiting. And though the law had sided with me, I knew the war was far from over. The inheritance was mine. But so, it seemed, was Margaret's eternal wrath. The days after the trial blurred together, a haze of exhaustion and unease. On the surface, I had one eye was legally recognized as the heir to James's estate, his house, his assets, his legacy. But victory felt hollow when every shadow outside my window made me flinch, and every creak in the floorboards made my heart race. Margaret might have been dragged out of the courtroom in disgrace, but her presence lingered like a phantom. At first, I told myself she wouldn't dare come near me again. The courts had seen her breakdown. The public had witnessed her humiliation, and surely even she had to recognize the futility of her obsession now. Yet every instinct inside me whispered otherwise. 2 weeks passed. I tried to settle into a routine organizing the estate paperwork, transferring titles, setting up new locks on the doors, but the nights were the hardest. Sleep came in fragments, broken by vivid nightmares of Margaret standing over me, whispering that I had stolen her son. One night, the nightmare became something more. I woke with a start, the sound of glass shattering somewhere downstairs. My body went rigid. Every muscle screamed at me to stay hidden, but my feet carried me slowly, carefully down the staircase. In the dim light of the hallway, I saw it my front window, shattered inward. Cold air seeped through the opening, carrying with it the sound of footsteps on my hardwood floor. My pulse roared in my ears. Margaret? I whispered, though I already knew the answer. From the shadows emerged her figure-wild hair, clothes rumpled, eyes fever bright. She looked nothing like the composed woman I had once known, only a hollow shell of rage and grief. "You think you won," she hissed, clutching something tightly in her hand. It glinted in the moonlight, a shard of glass from the window. "You think he chose you, but he never loved you the way he loved me." Her words crawled under my skin, each syllable sharp and venomous. My voice trembled. "Margaret, stop this. James is gone. Fighting me won't bring him back." "He's not gone," she snapped, her voice shrill. "He lives through me, through what he left me. And you," she stepped closer, brandishing the shard, "you took that away." I backed toward the kitchen, my mind racing for a plan. The phone was too far. The doors were locked from the inside, the keys on the counter just out of reach. My only chance was to keep her talking. "Margaret, listen to me," I said softly, forcing my tone into calmness I didn't feel. "James didn't want us to fight. He wanted peace. Don't let this destroy you." Her face twisted. "Peace?" She spat. "You call stealing my son peace?" Her voice cracked, breaking into sobs that shook her frail frame. For a moment, the shard lowered, her rage crumbling into grief. And in that fragile instant, I lunged. I grabbed a heavy vase from the counter and swung, shattering it against the floor between us. The sound startled her, and I bolted past, sprinting toward the front door. My fingers fumbled with the keys, my breath ragged, but I managed to wrench the lock open just as her footsteps thundered behind me. I stumbled out into the cold night air, screaming for help. Lights flickered on in the neighboring houses. Within moments, sirens pierced the darkness. Margaret froze in the doorway, the shard slipping from her hand, clattering onto the steps. Her face was blank now, drained of fury, replaced with something hollow. When the police arrived, she didn't fight. She simply let them lead her away, her eyes never leaving mine. And in those eyes, I saw something I'll never forget, not hatred, not rage, but emptiness. As if losing her son had carved out her soul, and nothing was left but shadows. The following weeks felt surreal. Margaret was taken to a psychiatric facility, declared unfit to stand trial. The estate was secure, the threats ended, so the authorities said. But inside me, the fear still lingered. I kept the curtains drawn tight, the doors locked, the alarm system armed. And every time I passed the broken window now replaced with new glass, I remembered that night, the way she looked at me, the way her voice cracked when she said James was hers. People congratulated me for surviving, for winning. But it didn't feel like a win. It felt like a scar. I often sat in the study staring at James's photograph on the mantel. His smile seemed different, now less loving, more haunting. Sometimes I wondered if he had known, deep down, what his choices would unleash, if rewriting the will had been his final act of cowardice, leaving me to face his mother's wrath alone. And sometimes, in the stillness of night, I thought I heard it the faintest whisper, carried on the air. You stole him from me. I told myself it was imagination, just echoes of trauma. But the truth was that Margaret hadn't been defeated. Not really, because even locked away, even silenced, she still lived inside my nightmares. And in some twisted way, she would always be there, her obsession stretching beyond the grave, binding me to her forever. The estate was mine. The house was mine. But peace had been buried with James, and no court ruling, no second will, could ever bring it back.